When most of us picture the Crusades, we see armored knights marching toward Jerusalem, banners of the cross flying high, and stories told from European chronicles. But through Arab eyes, these same wars looked very different. In Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad, the Crusaders were remembered not as holy warriors, but as Franks, foreign outsiders whose presence was disruptive, violent, and at times strangely familiar. What is most surprising is that Arab chroniclers of the 12th century never even used the word Crusades. That label only appeared centuries later. To contemporaries, these conflicts were not framed as a grand clash of civilizations, but as immediate struggles born from politics, ambition, and human weakness. This is Armchair Archaeology, and today we are entering the Crusades from the Arab perspective, how they were lived, described, and remembered. Stay with us because by the end, you'll discover the forgotten name Arab chroniclers used and why that one word changes the whole story. Before we dive into that first brutal shock of 1099, take a moment to subscribe. If you enjoy peeling back layers of the past and seeing familiar stories from unfamiliar angles, you'll feel right at home here.
When the Crusaders stormed Jerusalem in 1099, Arab chroniclers described the horror in unforgettable terms. One account claimed that blood ran in the streets high enough to stain the legs of horses. Medieval writers often used such images to express grief as much as fact, and whether literal or not, it captured the shock of a massacre that became the defining memory of the First Crusade. For Muslims, Jerusalem was more than a fortress. It was Al-Quds, the third holiest city in Islam, home to the Dome of the Rock and the Aqsa Mosque. Its loss felt like a wound to the heart of the community. But what unsettled observers most was not only the slaughter, it was the realization that the Muslim world had been caught unprepared. While armies from across Europe marched in one direction, the rulers of the Middle East were trapped in rivalries. The Seljuks, a Turkish dynasty, were divided among competing princes in Syria. The Fatimids, a Shia dynasty based in Cairo, maneuvered to expand their influence at the expense of others. In Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph still commanded respect as a religious figure, but his authority was mostly symbolic. Records speak bitterly of how the defenders of Islam were too divided to respond, while the Franks seized city after city. European chronicles presented the fall of Jerusalem as a triumph of faith, the reward for perseverance on a holy journey. Arab accounts told a darker story. The Franks were not described as sacred warriors chosen by God. They were foreigners from distant lands who had taken advantage of Muslim weakness. For contemporaries, the First Crusade was remembered as both tragedy and lesson. The disaster at Jerusalem revealed that disunity could be as dangerous as any invader, a warning that echoed through sermons, narratives, and memory for generations.
The early Crusaders survived in the Middle East not only because of their determination, but because the Muslim world they invaded was divided into rival powers. Writers at the time often warned that the greatest enemy was not the Franks, but disunity within. Their accounts reveal a political landscape where no single leader commanded enough loyalty to mount a united defense. In Syria, the Seljuks, a Turkish dynasty that had once dominated the region, were fractured into competing principalities. Aleppo, Mosul, and Damascus often fought each other for dominance. In Egypt, the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty, had little interest in cooperating with its Sunni rivals to the north. And in Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliph retained symbolic authority, but his political power was a shadow of its former self. To contemporaries, this picture of fragmentation explained how a few thousand European knights could carve out states in Edessa, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Eyewitnesses spoke with frustration about these failures. One observed that the Franks fought with one heart and one will, while Muslim princes wasted their strength in civil wars. Some rulers even treated the Crusaders as pawns in their own rivalries. Damascus might besiege Antioch, while a neighboring prince quietly struck a truce with its defenders. In Cairo, the Fatimids even attempted to use the newcomers as a counterbalance to the Seljuks, believing they could be manipulated like any other local rival. These short-term bargains made sense in the moment, but they gave the Franks time to dig in. Accounts called it a bitter lesson. From the ashes of disunity came the idea that only unity could reverse the disaster. Preachers and writers began urging that the struggle against the Franks was not just the duty of one dynasty, but of all Muslims together. It's easy to forget that during this time, life under Crusader rule continued in surprisingly ordinary ways: markets, taxes, and even shared languages. And that daily blend of history and humanity, that's the spirit behind our Ancient Secrets mug. It's a nod to the layered, often overlooked stories we uncover here. You'll find it in our store, and the link is in the description.
After their victories in the Holy Land, the Crusaders found themselves ruling over a land that was already crowded with cities, villages, and diverse communities. Muslims, Eastern Christians, and Jews continued to live in Jerusalem, Antioch, and the coastal towns, adjusting in different ways to the arrival of foreign rulers. For many, daily routines carried on. Markets still opened at dawn, taxes were collected in Arabic, and Jerusalem's bazaars buzzed with sellers of bread, spices, and fabrics, much as they had before the conquest. The Crusaders relied heavily on the existing population to keep these systems running. Arabic was still spoken in the streets of Jerusalem and Antioch, and local officials often remained in place to manage taxation and law. Farmers continued to work the fields, although their crops now went in part to foreign lords. To observers, this continuity was striking and also humiliating. The land still functioned, but now under foreign lords. Restrictions, however, were real. In Jerusalem, Muslims were barred from entering the Haram al-Sharif, and the Dome of the Rock was transformed into a church. Such changes became symbols of loss. Yet outside sacred spaces, coexistence was often pragmatic. Merchants traded with Crusaders when profit allowed it, and some towns experienced stretches of relative calm. Over time, the Franks themselves began to adapt. Writers noticed them eating spiced foods, wearing lighter fabrics, and even visiting public baths. In coastal towns, intermarriage between Franks and locals created families that blended cultures. For Arab observers, these shifts revealed something telling. The invaders were not entirely separate from the world they had entered. They were slowly shaped by it, even as they ruled. This paradox of hostility and adaptation gave everyday life under Crusader rule its complexity. For many Arabs, the Franks were both conquerors and neighbors, symbols of loss, yet part of the society they had imposed themselves upon. To chroniclers, this mix of hostility and coexistence was a warning. Foreign rule could endure not just by force, but by adaptation.
In the medieval Islamic world, Damascus was more than a fortress. It was a city of orchards, gardens, mosques, and schools. A hub where caravans from Arabia, Persia, and the Mediterranean converged. During the Crusades, it became one of the main vantage points from which Arab chroniclers described the newcomers. The Franks, as they called the Crusaders, were portrayed not as holy warriors, but as outsiders, whose language, manners, and habits seemed crude beside the polished life of the city. The politics of Damascus were fluid and pragmatic. Its rulers sometimes resisted the Crusaders in open battle, but just as often they struck deals with them. When threatened by rivals in Aleppo or Mosul, Damascus might make a truce with Frankish lords, using them as pawns in a larger struggle. These choices often made sense in the moment, but they also gave the Crusaders the breathing room to establish themselves more firmly in Syria. Inside Damascus, life carried on despite the turbulence beyond the walls. Chroniclers noted that the city's markets were crowded with silk, glass, and spices, its mosques alive with scholars debating law and theology. Poets wrote of the beauty of the Ghouta, the green belt of orchards that surrounded the city. Even as armies marched nearby, Damascus projected an image of continuity and resilience.
Observers delighted in contrasting this sophistication with the roughness of the Franks. They wrote of foreigners fumbling with local foods, confused by spices, and ignorant of the baths that Damascenes considered essential. Against the elegance of urban life, the outsiders seemed awkward and provincial. To the people of Damascus, the city was not only a bulwark against invasion, but also proof of a civilization the Franks could never truly match.
While Syria bore the brunt of the early Crusader attacks, Egypt played a more complicated role. At the time, Cairo was the capital of the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia dynasty that often clashed with its Sunni rivals to the north. For the Fatimids, the Crusaders were not at first the greatest danger. Their real concern was keeping the Seljuks of Syria and Iraq from pressing closer to Egypt. This rivalry explains why the Franks faced little coordinated resistance when they first established their states in the Levant. In fact, the Fatimids initially tried to use the situation to their advantage. They recaptured Jerusalem from the Seljuks in 1098, only to lose it a year later to the Crusaders. To Cairo, the Franks were simply another power to bargain with, just as they had bargained with Bedouin tribes or Turkish warlords. Sources tell of envoys traveling between Cairo and Crusader camps, negotiating truces and even trade arrangements. At times, Egypt saw the foreigners less as a threat than as potential pawns in regional struggles. For ordinary Egyptians, though, anxiety grew. Cairo was still a bustling metropolis, famous for its mosques, markets, and libraries, but news of Crusader advances disturbed the city. Trade routes were threatened, pilgrimages to Mecca became more dangerous, and rumors spread in the bazaars. Writers describe a city that continued to thrive, but could not ignore the danger rising just beyond its borders. Egypt's position shifted dramatically with the rise of Saladin. He ended the Fatimid dynasty, brought Egypt under Sunni rule, and united it with Syria. From Cairo, he built the power base that eventually reclaimed Jerusalem. What had once been a court playing politics with the Crusaders became the heart of the counter-offensive that changed the course of the wars. And later chroniclers remembered how names and alliances shifted as quickly as the tides of power. Saladin's rise wasn't just a military campaign, it was a transformation of memory, power, and meaning. If you're enjoying this deeper look into how history remembers and forgets, consider leaving a super thanks to support the channel. It helps keep these stories alive and independent.
In the first decades of the Crusades, Arab chroniclers did not immediately describe the conflict as a holy war. To many, the Franks were another wave of foreign raiders, dangerous but no different in principle from Turks, Bedouins, or Berbers who had troubled the region before. Yet as the years passed, the scale of the threat grew harder to ignore, and a new way of understanding the struggle began to take hold. One of the earliest voices calling for change was al-Salami, a preacher in Damascus. From the pulpit, he urged his listeners to see the Crusaders as more than invaders. They were, he argued, a collective threat to Islam itself. His sermons declared that defending the Holy Land was not only the responsibility of rulers, but a duty shared by every believer. Chroniclers noted these words, though at the time many rulers were still too entangled in rivalries to act. Gradually, however, this message spread. The memory of massacres in Jerusalem and Antioch gave al-Salami's warnings new weight. Writers began using the word jihad more often, linking resistance to the Franks with earlier struggles in Islamic history. For ordinary believers, this reframing gave meaning to suffering. It transformed disunity into a moral failing and pointed toward unity as a sacred obligation. The process was slow, but its impact was lasting. By the mid-12th century, the idea of jihad had become a central part of resistance. Leaders such as Nur al-Din and later Saladin drew on its power to rally support. What had begun as scattered sermons in Damascus grew into an ideology that bound politics and faith together. For chroniclers, this shift was crucial. The wars of the Franks were no longer just invasions, but a test of the Muslim community's unity and devotion. No figure from the Crusades left a greater mark on Arab memory than Saladin. To later generations, he became the model of the just ruler, the defender who reclaimed Jerusalem and restored dignity to the Muslim world. Chroniclers celebrated him for his piety, generosity, and restraint. When he captured Jerusalem in 1187, he allowed most inhabitants to leave unharmed. This mercy stood in stark contrast to the massacre of 1099, and it became one of the defining images of the age. Yet the man himself was more complex. Saladin was not born to kingship. He rose through military service to his uncle, Shirkuh, a general under Nur al-Din, and built power carefully after becoming vizier in Egypt. Chroniclers close to his time noted his ambition alongside his devotion. In Cairo, he dismantled the Shia Fatimid establishment and replaced it with Sunni institutions, securing legitimacy while founding his own dynasty. His acts of mercy, though genuine, also served practical purposes, winning allies and strengthening his reputation. Legends grew quickly. Stories told of Saladin sending physicians to treat King Richard the Lionheart, or gifts of fruit and snow to a sick opponent during a siege. These tales, repeated in both Arabic and European sources, turned him into a figure admired across cultures. To Arab historians, they highlighted his magnanimity. To Western writers, they made him a knightly rival, embodying a shared code of honor. Long before his victories, preachers such as al-Sulaimi in Damascus had urged unity against the Franks, but their calls went largely unanswered. In Saladin, chroniclers saw those sermons finally fulfilled. In Arab memory, Saladin stood for something larger than his campaigns. He symbolized unity in a time of division. Through him, the calls for jihad became tangible victories, and the humiliations of earlier decades were redeemed. Chroniclers preserved his story not only as history, but as a lesson. Leadership, justice, and unity could achieve what seemed impossible.
During the Crusades, Baghdad was still the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, but the city's golden age of power had long passed. The Caliph remained a figure of enormous religious prestige, yet his political authority barely extended beyond the city itself. Real power lay with the Seljuks in Syria and the rulers of Egypt, who commanded the armies that shaped events on the ground. For Baghdad's writers, the Crusaders were distant. They threatened Syria and Palestine, but they did not march on the Abbasid capital. Even so, the caliphs could not remain silent. From the pulpits of Baghdad's mosques, preachers condemned the Franks and called for unity. Letters and proclamations urged princes to defend Jerusalem. Accounts preserved these declarations while acknowledging how little they changed the fractured reality of Muslim politics. Despite this weakness, the caliphate's symbolic role remained powerful. Chroniclers describe the caliph as the guardian of Islam, a figure who embodied unity even when his armies were weak. For rulers like Nur al-Din and Saladin, appealing to the caliph was less about faith alone than about politics, a way to turn spiritual authority into real legitimacy. Pilgrims and traders carried stories of the Crusaders back to Baghdad, feeding both fear and anger. In the city's imagination, the struggle was always present, even if its front lines were far away. This symbolic authority mattered. When leaders such as Nur al-Din and Saladin sought legitimacy, they appealed to the caliph for recognition. Their victories were tied to the authority of Baghdad, binding local power to a universal ideal. Chroniclers highlighted this connection, presenting the capital as the heart of Islam even in decline. For later readers, Baghdad's perspective reveals something crucial. The Crusades were not only wars fought on battlefields,
they were also struggles over meaning and legitimacy. And in that contest, the caliphs still had a voice. Even weakened, Baghdad remained a beacon of identity in an age of division. By the 13th century, the Crusaders were no longer the terrifying force they once were, but their presence still lingered in castles, taxes, and memory. Which makes us wonder, if you lived back then, would you see the Franks as enemies or just neighbors from a different world? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your take.
By the 13th century, Arab historians no longer described the Crusaders with the same awe or dread that had followed the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. The Franks were still formidable, but they had become familiar. Narratives compared them to other invaders who troubled the Islamic world, from nomadic raiders to the terrifying Mongols. The newcomers were a nuisance, sometimes dangerous, but not a mystery. This shift is especially clear in accounts of the 5th and 6th Crusades. In Egypt, Sultan al-Kamil dealt directly with Emperor Frederick II. Their treaty of 1229 returned Jerusalem to Muslim control without a battle, a stunning reversal from the carnage of earlier wars. Chroniclers underlined the lesson: the Franks could be bargained with like any rival, and sometimes pen and seal were stronger than sword and shield. Writers described it as proof that the Franks could be bargained with like any other rival power. For readers of the time, this was a revelation. Diplomacy, not bloodshed, had achieved what armies once failed to secure. Even so, the presence of the Crusaders was deeply felt. Their castles rose above Syrian hillsides and along the Palestinian coast, looming reminders of foreign rule. Farmers and merchants adjusted their lives around these strongholds, paying new taxes and rerouting caravans to avoid trouble. Records reminded their audiences of these daily hardships, ensuring that resentment toward the Franks did not fade. Yet the tone of later accounts was more confident than fearful. Writers emphasized that the Crusaders could be beaten, contained, or simply outlasted, a striking contrast with the despair that followed the fall of Jerusalem in 1099. One likened them to waves crashing against the shore, violent in the moment, but destined to retreat. What truly endangered the Muslim world, he argued, was not the power of the Franks, but the divisions that weakened resistance. By the 13th century, the Crusades were remembered less as an unstoppable catastrophe and more as a cautionary tale about the dangers of disunity.
For centuries after the Middle Ages, the Crusades did not dominate Arab historical memory. Writers preserved the accounts, but for ordinary people, the wars of the Franks were just one episode among many invasions. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 or the long centuries of Ottoman rule left far deeper marks on daily life. To most, the Crusades were remembered, but not central. That changed in the 19th century. As European colonial powers expanded into the Middle East and North Africa, intellectuals and reformers began to draw comparisons between the past and the present. French rule in Algeria, British control in Egypt, and later, the carving up of Ottoman lands after the First World War made medieval narratives feel relevant again. Saladin, who had been remembered in the 12th century as both pragmatic and pious, was transformed into a national hero, an icon of unity and resistance against foreign domination. In the 20th century, the language of the Crusades became part of political discourse. Leaders in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad invoked them to highlight the dangers of division and the importance of solidarity. Newspapers and speeches sometimes used the word Crusader not only for medieval knights, but also for modern Western powers, turning the medieval invaders into a metaphor for colonialism and intervention. This blending of past and present ensured that the memory of the Crusades remained alive, reshaped for new struggles. And yet, when we return to the sources of the 12th century, a different story appears. For contemporaries, the wars of the Franks were immediate and human, shaped more by rival princes and shifting alliances than by any eternal clash of civilizations.
This complexity reminds us that how we name the past shapes how we use it in the present. We began with a question: how did the Crusades look through Arab eyes? Along the way, we saw the shock of 1099, the disunity that allowed the Franks to survive, the daily life of locals under foreign rule, and the sermons that transformed politics into ideology. We followed Damascus, Cairo, and Baghdad as they each wrestled with the newcomers, and we traced how Saladin's victories turned disaster into legend. Finally, we looked at how the Crusades were remembered centuries later, reshaped by nationalism and colonialism into a story that still resonates today. Now we return to the detail promised at the start. For the Arabs who lived through these wars, they were never called Crusades. Chroniclers of the 12th century spoke of them as al-Hurub al-Ifranj, the Wars of the Franks. The phrase al-Hurub al-Salibiyya, the Crusades, only appeared centuries later. That name matters. It strips away the myth of a cosmic battle between civilizations and shows how contemporaries really saw the conflict, not as destiny, but as outsiders intruding into a fractured world. This forgotten perspective reminds us that history is never fixed. The way we name the past changes how we understand it. For medieval chroniclers, the lesson was about unity and survival. For us today, it may be about how memory is reshaped to fit modern struggles. What do you think? Should we remember the Crusades as a clash of civilizations, or as Arab writers describe them, as the Wars of the Franks? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this perspective, subscribe to Armchair Archaeology so you never miss the next story. Until next time, keep questioning, stay curious, and remember, the past never truly disappears. It lives on in the names we give it.